18-year-old human rights, gender equality, and climate action young leader. In 2017, I founded Stolen Dreams, which is now an international organization working to counter human trafficking and intersectional issues. I am also a national gender youth advocate to UN Women and the first youth focal point for countering transnational organized crime to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. I've been learning about human rights, human trafficking, gender equality, and climate action for just over 5 years now, and working in and around these topics. I often work with young people internationally, mobilizing them, as well as local governments, member states of the United Nations, and a number of United Nations agencies as well, to really take internationally coordinated and intergenerational and concrete action against the exploitation of both people and planet. And these are not simple tasks. I spend huge amounts of my time with organizations, action groups, survivors, policymakers, educators, and I'm incredibly fortunate enough to learn from the best minds in the world on these issues. And I am deep now in the social impact world, always learning at speed and recognizing intersectionalities. And I'm not a leading expert by any means. I'm only 18 years old and very young and new to this movement. And I do get schooled weekly and I have to check myself. But I am a passionate young person who has a deep enough understanding of human trafficking and its intersections with gender and climate change. But most importantly, I'm not here to just give you my opinion. I am here to get you to understand the reality, because slavery still exists today. Modern slavery is the term that is commonly used, and I'm sure that many of you listening would have heard of it before. But what does it actually mean? Well, modern slavery is a broad umbrella term for several highly exploitative practices, including forced labor, bonded labor, the worst forms of child labor, forced marriage, and human trafficking, to name a few. Human trafficking is the main component of modern slavery that we see today. And this really involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion or fraud. And ultimately, it's about having control over another person for the purposes of exploiting them into one of the forms of modern slavery that I just mentioned. But it is important to understand that modern slavery and these exploitative practices that we see today are not new. They have been deeply embedded into the socioeconomic fabrics of our societies, deeply rooted in our global economy and systems over centuries. And women, girls, and children are disproportionately impacted. Of the 40+ million people in modern slavery globally, 1 in 4 are estimated to be children. And data suggests that 1 in every 130 women and girls globally is living in some form of modern slavery. And that is a shocking statistic. Now, one of the root causes and enablers of exploitation is gender inequality. Now, gender inequality has created imbalances in power, and this is because sexism, discrimination, misogyny, and gender inequality are rooted in the political and socioeconomic structures of our societies and cultures. The legislation and societal attitudes that we abide by and the distorted requirements enforced on daughters as opposed to sons intensifies imbalances. Therefore, countries with a higher prevalence of gender inequality in terms of education, economic status, health, etc., will generally have a higher prevalence of modern slavery. Now, women are globally more likely to live in extreme poverty and report more food insecurity than men. And this leads to lack of access to education, with statistics showing that people living in lower income households have higher rates of illiteracy, and that women in these households are the most vulnerable of all. Inadequate education limits employment opportunities for women, and in particular limits decent work for women and girls. And subsequently, women have less access to economic opportunities, whereas men have greater opportunities. And women are therefore at a higher risk of modern slavery because without access to substantial education and without access to these fair and decent work and economic opportunities, they are left marginalized and vulnerable to trafficking in persons. Cultural practices, beliefs, and institutions, lack of independence, restricted job opportunities, and access to education, these are all factors that generate risks and exacerbate vulnerabilities to modern slavery that disproportionately impact women, girls, and youth. While in some cultures it is believed that forced and child marriages are the best way to improve or secure the future of a daughter, there may be severe health consequences. Such marriages can also increase the risks of other types of exploitation, and this is notably sexual exploitation in the form of sort of domestic violence, servitude, and even rape. Discriminatory legislative practices, including unequal inheritance rights, where husbands have the legal right to prevent their wives from working, including no legal protection from domestic violence, exemption and lack of prosecution for rapists if they are married to or if they do marry their victim. These all disadvantage the position of women and girls, and these gaps in legislation and legal protections for women and girls must be addressed urgently to help reduce inequalities. And so moving forward, we must ensure that there is adequate access to education for women and girls, improved across the world, even in the UK, even in a context that's very much close to home. In addition, economic and vocational opportunities for women and girls must be provided in an effective manner, and work has to be carried out on a local, community, grassroots-oriented level to change damaging gender bias attitudes. And that is the theme for International Women's Day this year, is to break the bias and to work with communities on a very grassroots level to unravel these systemic inequalities. So now these gender dimensions of exploitation and modern slavery have been understood, let's explore how it intersects with the second component of this year's theme, which is around climate change. Now, climate change is disrupting livelihoods, putting people in danger and accelerating migration. A 2018 World Bank report stated that by 2050, if climate action is insufficient, more than 140 million people may be displaced by its impacts. There is unfortunately an incomplete understanding of the relationship between climate change, environmental destruction, and modern slavery. But these complexities must be acknowledged and understood. More attention has to be given to the racialized and gendered impacts of climate change and environmental destruction, such as the links between extractive industries and trafficking for sexual exploitation, and the persistence of forced labor involving peoples of lower castes, as well as indigenous adults and children. The impact of climate change on modern slavery will inevitably impact women, girls, and children the most. And these impacts include increased uncertainties, so loss of security and damages to well-being, which heightens economic precarity and drives migration. And this migration could often be risky and unsafe, which leads to increases in human trafficking. Unsustainable development reflects a global economic system that privileges unfettered growth over sustainability, well-being, and human rights. And siloed approaches overseen by distinct ministries within sort of national contexts may often be very different or contradictory in their aims and methods. And there is a lot of conceptual confusion, especially in the policy arena, particularly around climate change and climate-induced migration, but also language around forced labor. These are very notable. In the agriculture industry, there is also a clear link between climate change, slavery, and gender inequality. The vulnerability faced by agrarian communities in the global south, particularly women and girls, because of current and future climate change impacts, such as the rise in severity of droughts and flooding, as well as increasing sea levels and temperatures, is the driving factor behind exploitation. Small farming communities with declining state support and who are facing increased marketization in agriculture are more vulnerable to exploitative labor practices and human trafficking. In forest areas, due to the destructive nature of the logging industry, we have seen an increase in people, particularly women and girls, subjected to debt-bonded labor in deforestation sectors. Other studies have highlighted the dependency in Brazil and Indonesia on expensive charcoal, cattle, and palm oil industries upon an exploited workforce. This shows that debt bondage and debt labor is entangled with deforestation and the large-scale clearing of the Amazon, Sumatran, and Bornean rainforests. In terms of fashion, the fast fashion industry uses forced labor in supply chains. Again, women, girls, and youth comprise of most of these people engaged in forced labor within this specific industry. In Uzbekistan and the Xinjiang region of China, and even in Bangladesh and India, people, including children, and most notably girls, are being forced to work to source cotton and garments to these fast fashion companies. 1 in 5 garments produced today are made by Uyghur forced labor in China. And not only are fast fashion brands such as H&M, Primark, Zara, and Boohoo, and many more profiting from the exploitation of people, well, they are also negatively impacting our environment. The fast fashion industry accounts for around 20% of industrial water pollution, 35% of ocean microplastic pollution, and it produces vast quantities of textile waste, emitting over 1.2 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. When we speak of a climate just transition to renewable energy, which is great, and it's something that we definitely need, a vision of a sustainable world, it is important that we're putting people and workers' rights at the center of these conversations. For example, currently, especially after COP26, there is a push to invest more in solar energy. However, nearly every solar panel in circulation globally is produced using forced labor from the Xinjiang region of China. So really, climate change is disrupting livelihoods. It's putting people in danger and accelerating migration. There is a strong connection between risky migration and various forms of exploitation. Even as migrants face the risk of being exploited, the detrimental effects of climate change are a major factor behind driving further migration. And these phenomena are very closely interconnected. Unfortunately, today, again, efforts to combat modern slavery tend to be specialized and limited to circumscribed areas of state activity. Modern slavery is really this multidimensional social issue. In focusing on only one of these dimensions, states and all efforts will fail at adequately preventing harm and protecting victims. The human impacts of climate change are likely to compromise every human right. Now, this really points to an urgent need to adopt a human rights-based approach to tackling climate change, one that centers gender equality. Moving forward, we must empower communities by ensuring collective and individual rights, particularly the rights of women and girls. We must be including marginalized and affected communities in decision-making processes, and we have to be providing comprehensive social protections and services and facilitate safe migration routes. It's also important to regulate public and private entities, listening to workers through comprehensive reporting and transparency, supply chain regulation, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws, enforcing sanctions, respecting labor unions, and embracing worker-driven systems of monitoring and enforcement. And it is also important to respect this principle of common but differentiated responsibility for climate change by combining drastic emission reduction measures in richer, high-emitting countries with significant and sustained financial remediation packages to countries already suffering loss and damage. This will help to support comprehensive adaptation and build resilience in at-risk communities. And we have to ensure that this financing is gender sensitive too. We know that the climate crisis is worsening existing gender inequalities and power dynamics. Across the world, women and girls are most at risk. Every part of the world is already being hit and will face escalating costs, with marginalized people being most at risk. Continuing inequalities dictate who is allocated resources to mitigate disasters and those who are left to face the consequences of climate and ecological breakdown. Gender inequality is a barrier to access and control over resources, equal rights, and decision-making processes. And yet women and girls are leading the climate movement and are effective agents of change in both mitigation and adaptation. Women, girls, and youth have a strong body of knowledge and expertise crucial to climate change mitigation, disaster reduction, and adaptation strategies, including Indigenous women who play a key role in their communities in safeguarding our biodiversity. But women and girls are not well represented within decision-making spaces. The education of women and girls is needed as a key to climate action, and gender equality needs to be higher on the agenda in climate policies. Right now, more than ever, it is crucial to unite to address the role of gender in climate change. We need it to safeguard our planet and to address social inequalities within climate action. Today and throughout this summit, young voices are being heard. This is our future, and we are reclaiming that. We, the youth, are a critical constituency, and it's just so important for us to feel empowered to engage with gender equality and climate action. And one way in which we are doing so is with UN Women. Every year, member states of the United Nations convene for the Commission on the Status of Women, which is referred to as CSW. And CSW is the principal global intergovernmental body exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. It is instrumental in promoting women's rights, documenting the reality of women's lives throughout the world, and shaping global standards on gender equality and the empowerment of women. During the Commission's annual 2-week session, representatives of UN member states, civil society organizations, UN entities, and youth gather at the UN headquarters in New York, although this year and last year it's been held virtually. They discuss progress and gaps, as well as emerging issues that affect gender equality and the empowerment of women. Member states will agree on further actions to accelerate progress and promote women's enjoyment of their rights in political, economic, and social fields. And these outcomes are called the agreed conclusions. And every year has a different theme too. But this year is particularly important and particularly close to the heart of our generation, because this year's CSW, the 66th session, which we refer to as CSW 66, has a priority theme of achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. Now, climate change, and as I'm sure you've heard from all of the young speakers at this summit, is something that we as youth are determined to address because it directly impacts our future. It renders our future uncertain. And in this regard, UN Women is really supporting young people in building and strengthening coalitions of support for the integration of gender perspectives into the climate, environmental, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs of our organizations and capacity. As global youth, we convened to hold the CSW 66 Youth Forum last Friday and Saturday, which brought together over 1,500 young people and decision makers into a virtual room to have constructive dialogues and conversations about how we can take climate action through a gendered lens by meaningfully engaging with governments to ensure that national, legal, and policy frameworks on these issues address the rights and the needs of women and girls, but also foster women's and young women's participation in decision-making and leadership. We also published our global youth recommendations, which have been sent to all member states, having carried out over 25 grassroots consultations, reaching thousands of young people. And I am incredibly proud to be one of the co-authors, working with a team of 5 other incredible young people. And these recommendations have really offered a unique opportunity to have a productive dialogue about climate change and environmental disaster reduction, but in the context of gender equality and its impact on women, girls, and youth, and to identify areas for policy development and risk reduction. Now, these regional and grassroots community conversations have been led and facilitated entirely by young people, and the outcomes have formulated key messages and recommendations from youth that have informed a set of practical recommendations for a youth and gender-centric, holistic, and integrated climate change strategy. And we really do hope that these recommendations will promote environmental and disaster risk reduction initiatives that uphold rights, build resilience, and foster a lasting green recovery, centering the rights of women and girls. And last week and the week before, we had been on 17 plus hour Zoom calls, collating these recommendations and then referencing them with agreed language of the United Nations, so language that member states have agreed on in previous resolutions and conventions. And then we would cross-reference them with the first draft of this year's agreed conclusions, identifying areas where we as youth see the need for language to be strengthened or areas that are completely missing. So for example, in the first draft, we saw that there was no mention of migration or human trafficking, despite those clear links between climate change, human trafficking and migration, and its particular impact on women and girls. But together, we have made incredible progress, and we do know now that these recommendations have been discussed within negotiations between member states. And I myself had the opportunity to sit with the UK government and negotiators to go through line by line exactly what we as young people would like to see. So this youth inclusion has been a great step forward, and this is the first time that UN Women has seen a success as strong as this with regards to participation of young people at CSW. And the formal CSW actually begins on the 14th of March, so a few days from now. So this is very much the beginning, and we are in the early days. And so we do look forward to engaging and negotiating with member states more this month. But women, girls, and youth must be at the heart of climate solutions. This is clear. This means meaningful inclusion, co-leadership, co-ownership, and co-creation. As youth working within the structures of the United Nations and other advocacy spaces, particularly within the human rights and gender equality sectors, we are persevering. It is not easy, but we are pushing hard. We do face exclusion. We are tokenized and dismissed from spaces where we have the right to be. And this has been incredibly tough, emotionally and physically. It's definitely taken a toll on my well-being, and we've seen this collectively coming together as colleagues and sharing our experiences. Even the workload involved, the consistent hard work, pushing for young people to have space, negotiating with governments, making sure that what you say in terms of the language you're using is concise and appropriate to the political setting or context that you are in. It is overwhelming, and often I have felt that I'm at a breaking point, exhausted and frustrated. And in fact, you've probably heard it in my voice, but after 2 weeks of barely any sleep and Zoom calls that have lasted 17, 18, 19 hours, plus university work too, and maintaining a social life as well. I'm not feeling too good at the moment. I'm coming down with a bit of a cold, I think. But it's important to remember that we aren't alone in feeling this way. And that is why I'm so grateful to have colleagues and peers, youth and intergenerational colleagues, the people who have organized this conference, who I can share these experiences with, who are there to support us. And most importantly for me, they remind me to practice self-care, because we as youth activists, we're in this for the long run. So we must set ourselves boundaries, take breaks, and look after our well-being, because in order to help others, we have to make sure that we're at the top of our game and we're helping ourselves. Nevertheless, we continue, because women and girls and youth must have seats of equal value at the decision-making table as co-leaders, co-creators, and co-owners. There must be accountability and transparency measures implemented, and our efforts need to be funded and resourced adequately. Internationally coordinated and intergenerational, collective, collaborative, and cooperative action are what we need. These systemic changes to address power imbalances, to address gender inequalities, despite having their respective challenges, are achievable. And this summit, these 3 days have shown us the power of collective action. We have seen and heard stories of people who are championing climate action on the front lines and leading the movement at all levels. And now we just need to push for the political and corporate will to act, to truly leave no one behind, to break the bias and create a world that is sustainable and equitable for women, girls, and youth in all their diversity. One where human rights are respected, and one where every human being is truly born free and equal in dignity and rights, because climate justice is gender justice. Thank you so much for having me today.
All right, Ishaan, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think one of the things I would also like to add to everything that you have said is also the responsibility of those of us in the middle. So people like me, people like my colleagues, people like us who have had the opportunity to hone our skills and spend the last 15 years truly understanding how we can apply ourselves. We owe it to these young people to really be those in the middle and create these spaces or just utilize our skills in whatever way we can to really push this agenda forward. Because oftentimes I find people get trapped in this perception that this is just a fight for the young people, and it really isn't. It's for all of us. And that's why for me personally, it's always been really important to support the work Ishaan does, or what Elizabeth does, or what Jessica does. Because I consider myself that middle, and I want to be that person who can advocate for them, or do the many things that we can do to support the work that you do. So from all of us at Team Leaving a Legacy, we love you. You're one of our favorite youth activists. We've always enjoyed watching you grow. And I think if I may reflect, when we had Ishaan at our last climate summit, that was over 2.5 years ago. And I remember leaving that summit thinking to myself, wow, there's so many amazing enterprises and business owners who are doing fantastic things. And I have to say, with this summit, I genuinely feel I'm leaving knowing that there's such accomplished people like yourself, like Jessica, like Carla, like She Changes Climate, who are really, really knocking on those doors for policy, for real big change that 2 years ago I think I definitely felt myself thinking, when is that going to happen? And now this summit has literally been proof of all of that from all of you. So thank you so much for sharing that side of this. And happy International Women's Day. And just Ishaan, thank you so much for always giving us your time and helping us bring this summit to a close.
Thank you so much.
All right. And thank you to everyone who's attended. We appreciate so much all of the efforts that you have made. We hope you found it to be educational, but most importantly, I really hope that it's been inspiring to all of you. We've heard so many wonderful messages of inspiration through so many speakers. And I just want to say a really heartfelt thank you from our team. It's not easy to put up events like this, but we always persevere because our mission has always been to make this sort of education and knowledge accessible to as many people as possible. So thank you for helping us realize that. And most importantly, just thank you for helping us realize our mission to plant 1 billion trees across the world in the next 30 years. And with you guys joining the summit, you really are helping us move that forward. So thank you once again from all of us, and thank you to everyone who joined. Have a lovely weekend.